All right. So today's talk is going to be about building a Science DMZ at a small college, and it's going to be presented by the team at Franklin and Marshall, which includes Jason Brooks, John Miller, Carrie Rampp, and Alan Sutter. They are on the line, and I don't know what order you guys are going to go in, so I will just turn it over to you, and thanks for presenting.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. We're happy to be here. I think we have a pretty informal presentation, but we'll sort of switch back and forth depending on the topic of the slide as we sort of step through some information. I wanted to first mention that one of our members, John Miller, is actually not here in the room with us where you can see us, but he is on the line. So when we get to certain questions, it may be that we'll need to unmute him for a moment depending on what comes up. I guess I should also say in some ways, seeing some of the content from other sessions, this is a little bit of a less technical brown bag, but we will step through our design and some of our trials and tribulations as we move forward. But to start with a couple of quick introductions, I'm Carrie Rampp. I'm the CIO here at Franklin and Marshall, and I'm also the PI on the NSF CC Store Grant that we received in 2015. And Jason, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jason Brooks. I'm the systems admin and project manager for research computing, and I help to co-write the grant and obviously deal with a lot of the researchers. So,
I'm Alan Sutter. I'm the CTO.
And John Miller, who's on the line, is a network analyst here. So first, I wanted to mention that part of the reason we titled our presentation "The Trials and Tribulations" was because as we talked with Jason a little bit, or as he talked with me about presenting, I said, we ran into some problems and some delays, and some things didn't go the way that we expected. And I felt he was definitely encouraging us to share some of the things that had been more difficult rather than simply overviewing our project. So we are going to try to make sure that those things are mentioned and described. But first, a little bit about F&M, if I can get to my next slide here. Now it doesn't want to play. Oh, back. There we go. Just a little bit about F&M. We were founded in 1787 by Benjamin Franklin, and we are located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We are a small residential liberal arts college with no graduate students. We have a 10-to-1 student-faculty ratio with just 2,400 full-time undergraduates. So we are a pretty small shop. We
should talk about why we wanted to apply for a Science DMZ.
Right. So we, sorry, I want to just flip over my notes here. Thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about, why we thought we would go down this road, and Jason's going to say some things about that.
So first of all, why did we need a DTN and a Science DMZ? And a lot of it has to do, obviously, with our faculty research here. Even though we're a small institution, we have a lot of faculty researchers that require data that's off campus, whether it's thousands of neuron images from a confocal microscope that can be turned into a modeling system to be able to predict neuron degradation, or if we're talking about pulsar data, tons of radio telescope data that has to be sent to our network so that we can analyze it. So obviously that's the first requirement. The second thing that we saw was that a lot of our faculty are collaborating with other institutions and other faculty members. They want access to our data. We need to give them access. So basically, a lot of them already have DTNs. They want access to storage arrays that might be strewn around campus that aren't centralized, that are attached to clusters. And this is a perfect way to organize it and kind of get with the program to transfer data to DTNs that they already have. So when we first applied for this, there were a few exceed allocations, but that's grown pretty considerably, as well as usage of AWS and cloud stuff. That's just going to get more and more. It's going to increase here. We're starting to teach with exceed allocations for parallel computing and stuff like that in our computer science department. Once we start getting to like data analytics and need to move large data sets around, we want this to be in place so that we're ready for that. And then part of our problem is that researchers send and receive big data from distant locations. We have an astronomer that sends tons of radio telescope data, or receives tons of radio telescope data from Puerto Rico and Australia, and how he's been doing it because of the slow network and our inability to accommodate his data transfers is literally taking half a dozen USB drives, sending them over to these telescopes places, having them put tons of data that he needs, and then shipping them back, which is ridiculously inefficient, obviously. So we needed to take care of that. And that's a continuous process. You can constantly get more and more astro data, terabytes of it. So, and then we realized we're going to have the problem of faculty continuously trying to apply for grants, get more stuff. When we first applied for the grant, we didn't have a confocal microscope. Now we do. And that confocal microscope is being used by faculty from a lot of different disciplines, and they all have research partners in different institutions. So we're going to get more storage. We're going to get more HPC stuff. We can use this as kind of a springboard to try to centralize all that stuff. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So why else do we feel poised to apply in 2015? We did some pretty major network upgrades here. We upgraded the network core and edge. We upgraded the core from 1 gig to 40 gig. And some of our edge switches were 100 megabit per second switches. So obviously, if you had that hooked up to a computational machine, you need to transfer data. That's not going to work. Like I said, this is the beginning of centralizing systems and services. We want to take our DTN and eventually apply for a cluster on campus that we can definitely use. We want to apply for a storage array that we can share so that things are not as distributed as they have been in the past. And then we're also building a new data center to house research computing and also for redundant communications between our main data center. And of course, we got connected to Kimber, which was a huge boon for us because, you know, no matter what we do with the network, obviously we need to be able to connect to other institutions where our researchers are working.
So sorry, let me get my slide to go along here. It doesn't seem to want to. Okay, there we go. So in 2015, we decided to pursue an NSF CC Store Grant with the stated goals that you see here, and I'm not going to read those to you, but they follow very much along the lines of some of the things that Jason was describing as challenges. You know, simply strengthening our ability to support faculty in their collaboration internally and externally, you know, being in a better position to prepare our students who are going to pursue career paths and graduate programs and other postgraduate work where having these opportunities is really important. And so we felt like we were in a good position to attempt to get this grant. The program award that we received is one in which it's kind of an interesting thing based on other channels with the NSF, but the first year you apply with a fairly decent looking plan, and then your first year is actually doing the more intensive planning work to prepare for your project. So we were approved, and then we had a year period where we worked very closely with our leadership institution, Kimber, which is our research and education network here in Pennsylvania. We also did a number of site visits to some other institutions. We hosted one of the operating innovative network workshops here in Lancaster, thanks to some of our friends. And truly, we felt really blessed that Jason, our host here for this webinar, and Ken Miller at Penn State and colleagues at Lehigh, you know, really helped us in both gaining expertise, but also thinking through our design and how to approach things. So at the completion of that first year, we submit to the NSF in that first year report our imagined plan in order to be approved as you move into year two. Alan's going to talk a little bit about some of the elements that made up that proposed strategy.
Yeah, so as I said, as Carrie just said, we talked about, you know, taking the first year to plan this out, and this is really what we came up with, which was then shown in our first report after the first year. Obviously, the goal here was to build a Science DMZ and a DTN, and we spent a lot of time architecting exactly how that would look. As part of that, we we wanted to include a number of perfSONAR nodes. We actually had one on campus beforehand, and we're increasing that to 3 as part of this project. Again, it being a small college, we want to try and keep things as simple as possible, both for us and for our faculty. So joining Globus looked very advantageous to us to try and keep things simple. We upgraded our Splunk license in order to be able to monitor all of the work that was happening here to get a better sense so we could benchmark how we're doing and the improvements we were able to with this grant. We got connected to Internet 2, and we joined as a full member, and as part of we upgraded fiber on campus because we were maxed out on certain things, and in order to be able to create the 10 gig or 40 gig connections between the different data centers, we needed more fiber, so we added that. We had plans to add that in. We put in the plan upgrade to our connection to Kimber's Penryn network from our 1 gig connection up to a 10 gig connection. And we also, in order, again, to get a better sense of how we're doing in benchmark, we were going to start collecting SFlow data. So I'll talk a little bit about how we went through the design. So this was our initial back of the napkin design of how we wanted to do it. So this was a very rough idea. The main concept we came up with was to try to make use of a SAN storage and fiber channel to basically isolate the DTN from our campus network so that there was no backdoor. So as you can see there, stuff that's in blue is the existing equipment that we already had, and the stuff that's in green was stuff that we were adding through the NSF grant. So this was our first shot at it. So as you can see, up towards the top in the gray box is the actual part, which would be technically part of the Science DMZ. And then we have stand storage, which sort of straddles it, and then a NAS head on the inside of our network, and then some new 10 gig switches. So this is what was our first shot at that. And we spent the first year talking with a bunch of people, as Carrie mentioned, and as a result of that, we were able to flesh this out to a more robust plan. So this is where we ended up at the end of the first year as part of our putting in for actual equipment and our first year report. So we expected to be able to use our current router on the edge, the Brocade CDS router, adding another 10 gig switch, and to the DTN itself, and the perfSONAR node, and purchasing a compellent SAN. And then we decided to use the Brocade VDX switches. We are a Brocade shop here, so it was because we're a small college and not trying to learn lots of new vendors' equipment, we decided to try and do as much as we could with vendors we were used to working with. So our entire core of our network is Brocade MLXs, and our edge switches are all Brocade switches also. So this was able to fit into what we were doing already. And then we already have a couple of compellent SANs, so it made sense to just add a third one to that. So this is where we were at the point we're at the end of the first year.
So in terms of what went well, there's a couple of quick highlights. We certainly found that getting connected to Internet 2 and joining as a full member and having access to those resources went very well. Upgrading our circuit was a relatively smooth process. Building several perfSONAR nodes also, and of course the fiber work on campus. All of those items went very well. But perhaps what's more interesting is, what was a little bit more difficult. So the 4 items, and we'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail. Ultimately, we had decided to acquire a fair amount of our proposed hardware from Dell. And we had probably, the sort of combination of setbacks in that there was some defective hardware which arrived, which kind of screwed up our planned deployment date in June, and because there was downtime required to implement zoning on our SAN, we had to then move that to fall break, because by the time we could get the replacement parts and schedule some of the engagement to support us, there's no way we could have that kind of day of downtime for all of our campus services in the middle of the semester. As well, as we, and this is perhaps, these second items were actually earlier in the process than the first two, but because we're going to talk about those in more detail, I'm mentioning them later on the slide. But when we submitted our proposal, our first year report with our design that Alan had just reviewed, there were some questions that came back about some of the elements in our design and some requests for clarification. And so we began working again with Kimber to offer us some additional advice and guidance, as well as Jason and Ken from Penn State. And we'll talk about a little bit of that in some more detail on the next slide. But as well as we step back to address those questions, we identified that in working with Kimber that Kimber was going to have to replace some of their infrastructure to support us as we implemented the Science DMZ, which we had not uncovered earlier in our design consideration, which they happily did, but it was an extra step along the way that we weren't expecting. So to talk about a little bit of the change in design, I'll show this diagram again and turn it over to Alan, and then I can switch to the other one whenever you feel ready. Alan, this is the same one that was up before.
Okay, so this was the design that we had at the end of the first year, and again, as questions came back, it became clear that even though we had talked about making sure our routers had deep buffers, that the equipment that we had spec'd did not have deep enough buffers to deal with the data rates that we were hoping to get, and the distance away that we were going to be getting data from, coming from Australia and things like that. So it became clear that the existing border router we had, the Brocade CES, was not going to handle it, and even the ICX that we had spec'd was not going to handle it. And then we also figured out that the handoff that we were getting from Kimber and from the Penrad network, the Juniper switch, was again not up to the task. So we had to reroute things slightly. And we purchased an additional Brocade MLX.
I just switched to that slide.
Yes, we did. Yeah, switch there to replace our border router. Brocade was sort of involved with us in the design too, and so they were very nice in giving us a very good price to do that, even though it's a pretty high-end router. But it had the buffers we needed, and then that also allowed us with cards to go straight without having an intermediate switch. So that was a small change. It was definitely a cost item that we were not expecting. And as we already mentioned, that Kimber had to upgrade their Juniper switch to a router, their chassis-based router.
So take a moment and talk a little bit about where we are now. Jason, we're going to share some things.
So we obviously, the list is here. We have routers and switches online. S-Flow is ready to be licensing. Campus fiber is installed. WAN peering's up. The DTN and perfSONAR box are built. They're ready to be connected to the network and tested. They're not tuned. They're not, OS, TCP stack network adapters. None of that is tuned yet. We have to build the NAS head and complete tuning on that, and then deploy the 10 gig NICs for HPC nodes and computational machines that need to be connected to it. And then relocate one VDX switch to a different area where there's going to be more use with it. So as we look ahead, what feels challenging? I don't know about challenging, but there's going to be some time-consuming things. Eventually, we're definitely going to want to train the faculty on using Globus and the DTN, which is kind of a no-brainer. We definitely have science use cases, but we think that it's also a case of like, if you build it, they will come. We have a lot of, we've actually discovered a lot of cases that can probably use the DTN after we'd already applied. So, we've got new faculty coming in, including a new physicist that deals with Astro data. A new high-performance computing faculty member that deals with GPU data sets and stuff. We're going to get more of this, and we need to be able to support it. So we want to train faculty and let them know it's here and tell them to spread the word, since that seems to be our best way of figuring out who needs what. So the second point is kind of important. We were and remain a small team. We're a liberal arts college, so our goal is, teaching and the liberal arts education, and that has to come first. research computing is kind of something that we have been trying to get more attention to as regard to the powers that be. And we have, you know, my first job, like basically I was hired to work in computer science and build Linux client server stuff. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, you should work in decision theory. Why don't you build a decision theory lab and help the econ people? And then it was like, you know, we need film to have this client server environment. I'm like, film? Like that's way more complex than one person should be dealing with. So these things keep getting added on. They're like, oh, we've got these clusters that are on separate ends of the campus and we need somebody to fix them when they break or when researchers mess up their code or whatever. So we all pretty much wear a lot of hats, and basically our primary goal is to make sure that classes go on and that, you know, that stuff happens. But we're really trying to become more organized with research computing and get the word out. With tuning efforts, it's not really going to be difficult because of all the information out there, and Faster Data ESNet was awesome, and they've got a lot of stuff on their site and links to tuning from their site, so we definitely appreciate that. And then gathering pertinent benchmarking data to demonstrate impact on science servers. I don't think that's going to be difficult. I think that we need to be thorough with it. And honestly, as far as like the difference between this talk and probably the next talk that we should give, it's going to be lots of beautiful graphs and data transmission, you know, lots of good stuff that we could share so that people can see what we looked like before and what we look like after. So we'll definitely do that if people are interested.
And with that, that's really the basic overview of where we are and some of the challenges that we've encountered. As Jason mentioned, you know, we're still a few steps away from the end of our build. You know, we cleared a hurdle over fall break just a couple of weeks ago that had us at a standstill because of the delays I had mentioned earlier with Dell. And now that that is cleared, we have, you know, we can move forward, but, you know, as bullet 2 mentions here, some of the, you know, the timing of coming out of fall break, this is a difficult time in the year to try and take big steps forward that we had planned to do in the summer, but, you know, that's where we sit right now. But with that, I'd be happy to hear any questions that you might have or step back to any of the diagrams. I did see the note that said that, in fact, you see the presenter's view of the slides rather than the view that we see here in our video conference room that looks like the perfect slide deck projected. But I was not going to try and change that mid-presentation because that seemed a little bit of a risky proposition. But any questions? Okay, I will.
All right, so thank you guys for doing that. We don't have any questions yet, but we'll pause for a minute. I can start with a couple that I jotted down here. So now that you basically are almost ready to go, I guess the real question is sort of what's the first use case you're going to start to address? You know, which researcher on campus or which science use case are you going to spend your time to onboard first to this infrastructure?
Well,
That's a good question.
it is a good question. From my perspective, I'd like to get those USB drives that are flying around the country to stop. So the Astro data, of which there's, I mean, he claims that he can literally pull 20 terabytes of data if we can do it. That's what I want to test, and that's what I want to do first. Because that's what we're really prepping, like why we need deeper buffers and why, you know, we need the things we need for the DTN. So I definitely want to test that first. There is a DTN in Puerto Rico, Arecibo, but it's currently dead because of the hurricane. So the actual thing to do right now is send data via USB drives to Puerto Rico. So they're going to fix that.
Something ironic about us being just about ready to not have to do that anymore and Arecibo not being able to do it anymore.
So that's kind of the first thing I'd like to do is test that personally. We have a lot of use cases to test. So bad data, tons of tiny files, thousands of tiny files. We want to do it all. Good question though.
Okay. And sort of related to that is, do you sort of have a plan in place, or are you thinking about a plan for how how to physically train the researchers to get used to this. So, having done this a couple times, convincing somebody not to do the USB drive thing, of course, is the first step. But sort of the second step is, how do you integrate it into their workflow? And do you have a couple of willing or unwilling people to sort of start with?
Definitely. We definitely have some willing people to start with. And we want to obviously get the word out and hold clinics where we can demonstrate how to use Globus and what we're trying to do with it.
Another thing we did do when we laid out our proposal is we actually have 3 faculty co-PIs who haven't really had much to do because their role comes much later in the project, understandably. Yes. And so, I touch base with them periodically to talk about where we are with the sort of technical build aspects of the project. But the whole idea going back was in getting them to commit to being on the proposal was that they would be some of the folks. One of them is the researcher that Jason was just describing, working with data in Puerto Rico. And then 2 others that were hopeful, by being in that role, that they're set up to be first in line to do some of these things, particularly since we'll need to report out on how some of that work has gone.
And I think, sorry.
I was just going to say, there's generally a sense because they were involved in the front end and as part of, building the proposal for the NSF grant, I think there was a certain amount of them understanding how this actually would benefit them. So I think there is some willingness to work with us as we get this built.
And they're really the people that, some of the people that are writing grants that get the hardware that need this kind of thing. So what was I going to say? Yeah.
In terms of training, boot camp,
right.
Suggest.
So one thing that I'm kind of finding is that the fringe people, the people that you really didn't expect would be interested in this, are interested in it just because of word of mouth. Here, it seems like we had kind of a disconnect with the provost office and ITS, and whether or not, a faculty member will come and say, I'm going to apply for a grant for this, talk to the grants department, which didn't exist a few years ago. Or they'll say, we want to hire you at F&M. What do you need as part of your hiring package? And they'll say, I need a cluster, I need high performance computing or storage. Before, they would be like, here you go, buy it yourself. And then we would find out about it after it got shipped to our campus. And they're like, oh, by the way, a bunch of people need access to this storage array. Will this even work? Do we have the infrastructure to support it? And so we have to scramble around to see what we can do. And it's getting better, but actual word of mouth and talking to researchers, so that if the provost office doesn't tell them about it, a researcher that we've spent time with will talk to the new job applicant, or the new person that they're hiring, and will say, look, this person's reliable. We can have them help you figure out what you need. And that way we can talk to them and make sure that we have the infrastructure to support their stuff. I think with education, getting back to my point, I think it's going to be a similar situation where they talk to each other, even though they might not come to the event, or we might not hit them directly. They'll talk to each other, and word of mouth will get it around as well. I think we found anyway.
So that is a good thing about being small.
It is, right.
It's possible to talk with many of our faculty in just a few days' time.
But Jason, you will be involved in that. We'll I'm sure talk to you about that stuff as it happens.
All right, looking forward to it. So we have a question from Brett. Do you restrict access based on research, education, or other criteria, or is it anyone who wants to use the faster network can get access to it no matter what they are working on?
Good question.
As far as the campus network itself, as we stated, we had just upgraded that. And we're sort of piggybacking on that. So there's not really an additional out-of-network that's beyond our campus network.
But talking about that, we do want to centralize these computing resources so that, they have better access to where the data needs to go.
Yeah, the VDX switches, which are the 10 gig switches, are only located in the data center, our primary data center, and then up in the secondary data center where all the current HPCs, the centralized HPC right. stuff is. There's, again, as Jason mentioned, there's a whole pile of stuff that's sort of decentralized that we're sort of hoping to, encourage people to centralize because of the higher switch. So I think maybe another answer to your question is the expectation is we try to pull the stuff into a central location rather than push this high-speed network out to where they are. They're in just labs where our facilities and operations are frantically trying to put enough cooling in and things like that, and the correct power and stuff like that. So they're not really in good environments. So there's a lot of reasons to try and pull them into a central location.
Yeah.
Okay. So Greg from Globus notes that if you do need help with Globus training, shoot him an email. He left it in the chat room there.
Yes, thank you.
We've
I
been
wrote
talking
that
to
down.
People from Globus, so Bass, we've talked to him several times.
And Jim's question is, Brocade has introduced the SLX series. At one point, I thought that was supposed to be the successor to the MLX. He's not so sure, though. What is your view on this versus the MLXE futures?
The SLX is slated to be the feature to replace the MLXs. I don't think the MLXs will go away anytime soon. The SLXs are sort of coming in, at least I haven't heard much, but as far as what I know, it's coming in at a higher level. But I think for our needs, the MLXs are fine. We're certainly not pushing them by any means. So for a small college, the MLXs are fine. The SLXs are probably aimed more at an even higher level than we're at. If you start talking about 100 gig links and things like that, whereas we're just doing banded 10 gig links between the MLXs now.
Okay. So good questions so far. Keep them coming. I have another one that I jotted down. So early on, I think it was Jason was mentioning cloud use. So I guess just a general question of how many of your researchers do you see are turning to sort of cloud resources? Just maybe if you have a rough percentage. And do you anticipate that number will continue to grow since you really don't have a lot of centralized HPC stuff that's on campus?
Yeah, so I think it'll continue to grow for sure, especially as transfer data, data storage is cheaper and stuff like that in the cloud. I would say maybe 15-20%. It's not too much right now, but it will definitely become more popular, I think, in every aspect of high performance computing, and data analytics and stuff like that. So the funny thing is one of the reasons why, just kind of related to that we still want a centralized HPC cluster on campus that we can kind of talk to people about and get them to use, is that even though a lot of the people that we have that use Exceed or AWS or all of these cloud services, they might do the research on those cloud services, but they're still asking us for compute cores for their student research or research that they're working on with their student. So they might do, like Christine, one example, they might do some simulations on a small cluster that they use here, and then obviously they don't want to use all their Exceed allocations on testing, so they'll test it here and then farm it out to Exceed. I don't ever see that going away. And honestly, the fact that we're now teaching parallel computing with Exceed, I think that kind of stuff is going to become more common as well. We have computer scientists here that do AI stuff that can literally tap every single core that we throw at them. For our computer science machines, we use cores off those machines while students are working to actually do research jobs at the same time. And we try to utilize any single spare core that we can get because they can take it. So we'll always have, I think, on-campus solutions that we need, and maybe not all small colleges are like that, but a lot of people will try to do most of their research on the cloud as it becomes cheaper, as people learn about it.
So did Kimber have to, or I guess the question is more, does Kimber offer any sort of peering arrangement to some of the popular clouds that sort of helps with the wide area path, or does that all just sort of exercise your commodity connection?
They give us quite a bit. So they give us a VLAN, which is direct connection out to Internet 2. They have a peering VLAN, which connects to ESNet and all of the state education networks around us, Virginia, New York, New Jersey. They hook into the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, so there's a whole pile of things that kick in from there. So we have some pretty low number of hops and high bandwidth connections out to a lot of these research networks, which is awesome.
And then they're also like caching some services like the Google stuff.
But that's not so much related to this project, but they've actually been doing an awful lot in the last just year and a half to 2 years as far as peering into all sorts of research networks around.
So sort of a related question, and this sort of hits on what Carrie was talking about early on, since your particular reason for going, or the way that you approached this grant was you did partner with Kimber as sort of your larger institution that was helping with these things. Would you say that sort of arrangement was successful in helping get all these things off the ground? Are there ways that you would sort of look at, if a certain NSF program officer happened to be listening, ways that you would change the program in the future to make it more successful for other institutions that are sort of your size?
Well, I would say that having a clearly defined and named and agreed to leadership institution is actually one of the requirements to get your proposal approved. So it wasn't our idea, but I mean, I do think it is our unique idea. I do think it was really a valuable thing because early on, when we were thinking through our proposal and how, what to include, Kimber was running workshops and doing other things about these NSF programs and trying to encourage people to apply and helping them figure out how to apply and what to include, which we would not have been able to figure all that out just ourselves by reading the guidelines. And I mean, we could have tried, but I think it was much, much better because we had Kimber advising us on some of what to be thinking about and what to avoid.
They were a huge help as far as actually writing the proposal.
Right, right. And, and encouraging certain, you really want to be thinking about perfSONAR and, and like some elements like that as well. And then when we received the grant, and they were our named partner, they were really helpful in connecting us. They had their own in-house expertise, like Mike, Carrie, and some of the more technical folks there. But they are the folks who suggested, oh, you should talk to Ken Miller at Penn State. You should contact Lehigh. They got one of these grants a couple of years ago, and they have a larger team than you do. They introduced us to you, Jason, and we would have been kind of flummoxing around a little bit, I think, trying to figure out how to learn quickly, how to architect some of these things and get past theoretical to an actual design. So those, all that happened very quickly within a few weeks or months after receiving the grant.
All right. So I think I have one more, unless we get some more questions in the chat room. We don't have any so far. You mentioned at one point that since you are a sort of a liberal arts institution, you do have to have a focus sort of on teaching and education. Do you have any plans for sort of how you may work the design of the DMZ, or how somebody may construct a DMZ into any of the curricula that you're going to offer?
Like I said, there's talks about data analysis classes where you could definitely talk about terabyte-sized data sets that people have to analyze. And if it's going to happen, it's going to be probably computer science that does it.
The other side of things is one of the things that FNN hangs its hat on it is student involvement in faculty research. And so I think the expectation will be as we start using the DTN and Globus and things like that, as the students are involved in that research, they will be exposed to that. So not so much in a formal teaching environment, but just in the research environment, they'll learn some of those skills, which I think will do them well if they go on to grad school and things like that.
That's a good question.
I think the prospect of all of this, that we had the funding and that we were actively working on it, this is maybe not exactly to your question, but was something that Jason Brooks here in the room talked to some prospective candidates, faculty candidates about in terms of bringing top quality teachers and researchers to F&M, a lot of this is hidden, when you're here as a candidate, unless someone tells you that we have it and that we're working on it. And I think that was appealing to some of the computer science folks that they were trying to attract, which is a hard area to hire in.
Right, and I think that basically is indicative of all the research computing that we're trying to put together here. I mean, we really want faculty to come in and say, oh, they really care about our research. They want us to get tenure. They want us to push our field and be successful in the research. So,
yeah, and this project is a visible indication to them that it is important.
Yeah.
All right, and Ken has asked a question. Since you now have SFlow data available from all your Brocade switch ports campus-wide, have you found any new campus traffic discoveries from the SFlow that you wouldn't have normally interface counters?
No, because we haven't had the time to actually
look at the data.
Yes. So that'll be the next part of the next presentation.
But we will look for Ken.
He's always interested in making sure that you're getting all the stuff out of it.
Loves the SFlow. It's good though. It's cool.
All right. Well, unless there are no more questions, I want to thank you guys again for giving up some time this afternoon. I think it was great to hear about sort of your perspective on this. Just as a programming note, next week will probably be the last talk of the year, and it's going to be Princeton. They're going to be talking a little bit about their experimentation using SDN to control one of their border devices. So hopefully people can join for that. So thanks again to Franklin and Marshall. Just send me your slides when we're done here, and I'll get those posted. And hope everybody has a good weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.